Random thoughts. Were it not for the Talai people being faithful to the Kipsigis people, the Kipsigis today will be in Tanzania, not Kenya. That's what the British had planned, and the British was so much interested in getting the land that was occupied by the Kipsigis because it's a fertile and land that is located in a place with a very good climate for farming. So when the British came, they wanted that land so badly to the extent that they needed the Kipsigis to be moved to Tanzania. But that plan did not work, as I've mentioned, because the Talai people decided to be faithful to the Kipsigis. But the Talai people ended up paying so much for that, and they've continued to suffer to date because of deciding to stand by the Kipsigis and deciding to fight for the land of the Kipsigis so that it's not taken away. And I'm going to talk about that in this video. Now, in my previous video, I talked about the Loibon family that became or provided leadership to the Nandi and the Kipsigis and the larger Kalenjin community for about 2 centuries. And of course, I talked about the origin of this family, and I said this family was more likely Kwavi family, and the Kwavi are these groups of people, or a group of people who spoke the Maasai language. But when you look at the very old historical records, they are usually recorded as a separate group of people from the Maasai people. And when you look at some of the documents, the very old documents, they are described as looking more of Somali. Yeah, especially when you read document by Ludwig Kraft, that was a dictionary of the language that was spoken by these groups of people. Now, also in the previous video, of course, I talked about from the woman who came to the land of the Nandi, and she gave birth to twins, and she told the people she came from the family of the Laibon, and she had escaped from wherever she came from because of the wars that were going on between the different groups of people who spoke the Ma language. And then one of the twin brothers, that is Kobogoi, became the first Orgoyot of the Nandi people. And later on, his grandchild or grandson, who went by the name Kimnyole Arab Turukat, became the second or the next Orgoyot. Very little is known about the father of Kimnyole. Most likely he never became an Orgoyot, or maybe he became, but he was not a big one so that he was remembered. But the person who is remembered the most is the grandson of Kobogoi, that is Kimnyole Arab Turukat. Now, Kimnyole had several sons, and one of his sons is Koitalel Arab Somoe, and he was the youngest son. And another son was somebody who went by the name Kipchomber Arab Koilegen. Now, Koilegen was instructed by his father, that is Kimnyole, to leave the land of the Nandi people and go to the land of the Kipsigis. And he left, and in fact, even Koitalel Arab Somoe had been instructed to leave the land of the Nandi and move to the Keyo people. That's because towards his end, that is the end of Kimnyole, he wasn't in good terms with the Nandi people. And Koitalel didn't heed the advice. He remained among the Nandi people and he became their Orgoyot. But Koilegen left, and he didn't leave alone. He left with several of his other brothers, and they went to the land of the Kipsigis. And Koilegen became an Orgoyot of the Kipsigis people, and in fact, it is said that he became the first Orgoyot of the Kipsigis people. Now, in 1902, the two brothers, that is Koilegen and Koitalel, had very different, not actually very different, somehow how they interacted with the British was not the same, but in the end of it, both of them were punished by the British. Now, initially, in 1902, Koilegen signed a treaty with the British, and he decided to be friendly to them. But Koitalel did not want to do that. And Koitalel just went ahead and led the Nandi to, of course, to oppose the British rule. And we know what happened to him. He was killed in 1905. Now, when he died, it is then that the British decided to make Koilegen a paramount chief. Now, this is very important because often when we hear of paramount chiefs or chiefs, we often think these were positions that existed before the arrival of the British. The position of chief and paramount chief, these were creations of the British. They did not exist. When you go among the Kalenjin, they didn't have something like a paramount chief or a chief. What they had was a council of elders, and then they had the high priest, the Orgoyot. Now, the high priest would advise the council of elders, and the council of elders would basically make decisions. And of course, these were republics. The Nandi and the Kipsigis were republics, just like the Kikuyu was republic. They did not have chiefs. The chiefs was a creation of the British, and it was part of the strategy to control the population. Because the British did not like republics. Of course, they did not come from a republic, they came from a monarchy. But they hated a republic more especially because it was so difficult to control people through a republic. They needed a situation where there was that one man or that one woman who would say things, and things are done by the community. And that's why they decided to make some of these people paramount chiefs. So they make Colean a paramount chief in 1905. That's almost immediately after the killing of Koitalel Arap Samoei. Now, the making of Colean as a paramount chief of the Kipsigis people was part of a larger plan. And the larger plan was to take away the land from the Kipsigis. As I've said, the British was so much interested in that land. And initially, the plan was to remove all the Kipsigis from all the land they occupied in what we know today as Kenya, and to move the entire population to Tanzania. And by the British making Colean a paramount chief, that was part of the plan. They wanted to bring Colean closer to the British government so that they can use him to actualize that plan. Of course, they had realized what had gone on with the Orgoyot of the Nandi, and how he had made it so difficult for the British to even build a railway line crossing the land of the Nandi. And so they thought by making Colean a paramount chief, they will make him their friend, and then Colean will just help them achieve whatever they wanted to achieve. So, and they started giving him gifts and treating him like kind of like royalty. He wasn't royalty, he was just a high priest, but they started treating him as a royalty of the Kipsigis. And in fact, they started encouraging the Kipsigis to treat him as a royalty. And at some point, they invite him to Mombasa. And he goes to Mombasa alongside a few other elders from the Kipsigis community. They are invited to Mombasa. It was during the celebration of King George or something, maybe his birthday party, or him becoming the King of England. So he goes to Mombasa, he's bought clothes, he's dressed nicely, he's taken, given the good experience of the coast. And it is during this trip to the coast that he meets some British officials who explain to him what they need, and they tell him, we need to move the Kipsigis out of the land they occupy, and we want them to move to Tanganyika then. And of course, they tell him that's not going to be a bad thing for them. They are going to get a bigger land in Tanzania, and everything is going to be fine. And he himself is going to be, of course, given even more gifts and more power. And Colean comes back. This is around maybe 1914, 1913, around there. He comes back, and he tries to think through what these people were asking him to do, and he could not go through with it. He could not bring himself to trying to persuade the Kipsigis that it was good for them to move to Tanganyika as an entire community. And he talks to elders, other people in the community, and they decide they were going to resist the British. And so when he decides not to go along with the plan that was given to him by the British, guess what they do? They arrest him. This is in 1914, and they take him to Fort Hall, that is Moranga, and they put him in prison there. Now, Colean stays in prison in Fort Hall, that is Moranga, and a year later, or 2 years later, he dies in 1916, and is buried in Moranga, actually. But later on, he was, very recently, maybe in the year 2013, that's when his remains were moved from Moranga, and they were taken somewhere in Nandi or somewhere in Kipsigis land. So Colean dies in prison. Then the British initially tried to persuade his son, a guy who went by the name Kiboin Arap Sitonic, to play ball, like to do what the British want. But Kiboin decides to just do what his father had started, to resist. And he tells them he was not going to do what they were asking him to do. And in fact, he does the opposite. He he organizes the community to resist the British. And the Kipsigis start attacking the British settlers who had land around them. And that, of course, angers the British so much, and they are trying to see how to resolve that issue. And they arrest him and they put him in prison. That is, Kiboin is put in prison, not just him, but several other elders. And most of them came from the Talai clan, who, of course, the British knew had a lot of influence in the community. And at this point, whatever the Talai said, the rest of the Kipsigis population followed. They saw them as the mouthpieces of God, and whatever they said, that was what was to be done. So they are arrested and taken to prison. And when they are in prison, something weird happens. The British are so much interested in breaking the hold that the Talai had on the Kipsigis people that they resort to some rituals. And they organize an oath-taking process where they invite elders who are not arrested, who are still influential in the community, and most of them had converted to Christianity. They invite them to come to prison. And this process is led by one guy who went by the name Douglas Brumage. Now, Douglas Brumage, he was a district commissioner in Kericho. He organizes this event where some concoctions are prepared and then they are put in a human skull. And these elders are supposed to drink from that skull, and the point of it was, by so doing, by the elders taking from that skull, and then the Talai elders who were in prison taking from the same skull, they were going to break the hold that the Talai had on the people. And actually, the elders who had been brought to prison did actually take that concoction. But when it came to the turn of the Talai elders, they refused to do it. They could not do it. They said, we are not going to do it. And so that process was not completed. And the remaining Talai people, because they had grown into a huge clan, continued to lead the Kipsigis into opposing the British, into realizing that their land was about to be taken. And the British, of course, knew that the problem was the Talai. If there was a way we can remove the Talai from the population, then the rest of the community was going to be easy to control. Sadly, that was true, actually. That was true. And in 1934, the British passed what came to be known as the Talai Removal Ordinance, which was a law that was passed in the Legislative Council. And it mandated especially Douglas Bromage and, of course, his other civil servants to take all the Talai out of the Kipsigis land and to take them to Lambwe Valley in Luoland, in Gwasi. And that's what happened. The Talai were put together. Some of them managed to escape and they joined other clans of the Kipsigis and, of course, started passing themselves off as not being Talai. But majority were taken to Lambwe, which was a hostile environment, and most of them died there. And they stayed there for quite some time, from 1934 to 1962. Now, by the time they are brought back, that's close to 28 years. When Kenya is about to become independent in 1962, just a year before it becomes independent, the British go to Lambwe and they bring them to Kericho and they just come and dump them there. But I need to explain something that happened when the Talai were away in Lambwe Valley. The British resorted to a huge campaign to make the Talai look terrible in the eyes of the rest of the Kipsigis people. And they employed, of course, guess what? Religion. The British pumped a lot of resources into missionary work. And the churches were in the forefront of painting the Talai as evil and representatives of the darkness. And that campaign went on for those years that the Talai were not in the land, that they had been taken to Lambwe Valley. The church spread so much propaganda against the Talai people, and the people started fearing the Talai people to the extent that when the Talai were brought back, the Kipsigis community did not even want to be associated with them. And some of them, when they went even to school, the kids could not even disclose to the other kids that they are of the Talai clan, because the other kids, if they knew that, they will stay away from them. That's how much powerful the propaganda went, that the Talai were tarnished. They were basically character assassinated, and it was so effective. It worked. Now, while they were away, still, the British did not manage to remove the Kipsigis from their land and take them to Tanzania, but they managed to take a huge chunk of their land. Close to 1 million hectares were taken of the Kipsigis land, and the British took that land and they call it the White Highlands, and they started using it for farming, of course. And up to date, okay, much of that land has gone back, but there's still like close to 300,000 of hectares that are still held by companies that got it from the British Crown. So the Talai resisted, and the Kipsigis were never taken to Tanzania. But the British punished them by carrying out this massive propaganda that was done, especially through the church, to tarnish them, as to make them seem evil, and which worked. And when the Talai are dropped back, in fact, they were just dropped in Kericho in 1962. They were not given land, they were not given anything, they were just individuals there, they were dropped in Kericho. They became destitute, and because of the situation they found themselves in, of course, they needed to survive. Their women became commercial sex workers, and some others started brewing illicit brew and selling, and their image became that. Their image became that. They went from being the people who provided a vision for the community to being at the bottom of the community, to being seen as reject, to being seen as people who are outcast. That's what happened to the Talai. And the most unfortunate thing is that that happened out of the efforts that were put in place by the British. It was the work of the British that the Talai ended up being seen like that. And so, yeah, so the Kipsigis never ended up in Tanganyika, and that's good. But that happened thanks to the efforts of the Talai people, or at least the Talai people deciding not to betray the community. Actually, it was just that. But out of that, the Talai paid significantly. They paid a lot. And it's very unfortunate, and it's even shameful that to date, even as a country, we don't recognize the pain that they went through and try to make some things right for them. Those are my random thoughts.